Hello and welcome. I'm Pastor Mary Beth and this is the Trempealeau United Methodist Church. Today is March 6th, 2022. And we continue with God's story, our story, and we are on the very last chapter that we're studying in the Old Testament. We begin next week with the birth of Jesus. So today we continue to talk about rebuilding in Jerusalem after the people have been taken away to Babylon. So we take our reading today from Nehemiah, and I'm going to read that for you now. Almost 100 years had passed since some Jewish people had been permitted to return to Jerusalem. The temple was rebuilt, but the city walls were still in ruins. Around 445 BC, Nehemiah, Jewish cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, heard about this. And he said this, "I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. I had never before appeared sad in the king's presence. So the king asked me, 'Why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick. You must be deeply troubled.' Then I was terrified, of course, but I replied, 'Long live the king! How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire.' The king asked, 'Well, how can I help you?' With the prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, 'If it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried.' Artaxerxes gave Nehemiah permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. Nehemiah was made governor of Judea, the Latin name for Judah. He carefully planned and divided the work, and in just 52 days the walls were once again strong. But Nehemiah recognized that the real power of the Jewish people was not in the walls of stone, but in their faith and their obedience to God. In their fear, the Jewish people had forgotten the story of God's faithfulness. Now they were reminded. All the people assembled with the unified purpose at the square just inside the water gate. Ezra the priest brought the book of the law before the assembly, which included the men and women and all the children old enough to understand. He faced the square from early morning until noon and read aloud to everyone. The Levite priests clearly explained the meaning of what was being read, helping the people understand each passage. Then Nehemiah the governor, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who were interpreting for the people said to them, "Don't mourn or weep on such a day as this, for today is a sacred day before the Lord your God. Don't be dejected and sad, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." For the people had all been weeping as they listened to the words of the law. So the people went away to eat and drink at a festive meal, to share gifts of food with the poor, and to celebrate with great joy because they had heard God's words and understood them. For the next 400 years, the Jewish people living around Jerusalem tried to lead faithful lives as the tides of history swept over them. Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, and Judea became a Greek territory. Eventually, the Romans conquered all and installed a brutal puppet king, a man named Herod. And that is what will lead us into our reading for next week. So picture it, August about of 1996. My husband and I were set to close in our home in a new town. The place we were renting had changed hands. Our financing was in place, and Ali, the woman who had owned the place we were buying since the 60s, had rented a spot right next door so she would continue to feel part of the future of the neighborhood. All was in place. And then the wall that held up the house that we were going to buy collapsed. It just crashed down, took out the garage down below and left a gaping hole about the size of a semi in front of the front door. Luckily, Ollie wasn't hurt, just surprised. We all were. What now? Well, of course, the wall would have to be rebuilt before we could continue, and we were new in town. We just didn't know all that many people. But things started happening anyway. Our attorney reset a closing date. Our landlord did some juggling so we could stay for an extra month. The dump trucks arrived to haul all the debris away. The concrete company made room for us and was able to come and reconstruct the wall. And a friend of a co-worker who happened to be a contractor just happened to be available at that time to rebuild our garage. These people literally lifted us up out of the rubble. This week, we have watched in horror as the walls of Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities are falling. They're tumbling down under Russian bombs. Maybe, like me, you've wondered how something like this can happen in this day and age. It's a small world. It only takes 10 hours and 36 minutes to fly from Minneapolis to Kyiv. It's about the same amount of time that it takes to fly to Hawaii from Minneapolis. About the same number of people live in Kyiv as live in Chicago. I have people that I love who live in Chicago. Now imagine if it didn't just happen in Chicago, but it happened in LA and Dallas and New York, and it happened in Las Vegas and other inner cities. That's what it's like now in Ukraine. And every man in Ukraine between the ages of 18 and 60 is required to stay and fight this terror while their wives and their sisters and their daughters and their children and their mothers are trying to flee the country. These men have no military training. This is unimaginable, and yet here it is. Is there any more helpless feeling than being able to do nothing as this terror at the hands of a madman unfolds? What in the world do we do for these sisters and brothers who are suffering? I wish I had a tangible answer. Just as Jeremiah wept as the Babylonians captured Jerusalem, our tears are shed at the injustice of it all. When he learned that Jerusalem's walls were still in ruins, Nehemiah said, "I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned and fasted and prayed to the God of heaven." What I can tell you is this. I can tell you that the United Methodist Committee on Relief is actively connecting with partners in Europe to provide food and shelter and clothing and warm beds and rescue and medical aid, whatever might be needed. And the Trempealeau United Methodist Church will be collecting for the UMCOR, is the acronym for this, will be collecting for UMCOR throughout March. I can tell you that there are hundreds of United Methodist churches across Ukraine and Eastern Europe that are opening their doors as shelters for these displaced people to get away from the hunger and the cold and the hopelessness. Those churches are very much like this one. I can tell you that the bishops and other leaders across Europe are brainstorming to see how they might assist in peace building. Germany's Bishop Harald Ruckert said this: "Even if it seems naive in the face of weapons, tanks, and massive power plays, peacemakers and bridge builders are needed more than ever." And so even before the walls have finished falling, the rebuilding is beginning. God is catching the tears of the world and is extinguishing hopelessness and desperation with them. Our UMCOR dollars, our empathy, our understanding, our compassion, our prayers, our desire for justice are an antidote to hatred. And our prayers bring calm not only into the world, but into our own hearts. Amen.